All right, I'm going to go ahead and start. I'm Alex Swaim. I'm a programmer at Bonus XP, and we've been using the new enhanced input system in our project for at least a couple of months. We we looked into it, and it looked like it had some nice shiny new features. So we decided to move over to it. If you don't know what enhanced input is, it is a new gameplay-focused input system uh, from Unreal that's, as far as I understand, meant to replace the what I call the old input system, where you go into the settings menu in project settings and list out a bunch of inputs by string key, assign the controls to them, and essentially you bind input components to get raw input events back. And then you have to filter those on your own, make sure that whatever information is coming out of there is in fact what you want. And that's just kind of annoying. What enhanced input does is it it does a lot of that grunt work for you. Or it abstracts it out into a new system that lets you compose the types of inputs you want so that it makes it easy to separate your code implementation and the actual definition of what the input is and uh, what kind of data it's sending through to code. So it's really nice. Uh, the other thing that it's really good at is it is all asset driven. So for every action type, instead of having a string key that needs to match between your project settings and everywhere you try and use it in code, you're dealing now with objects, blueprint objects, which makes things a lot more explicit, just a little more safe and secure. And it also means that if someone updates something, it updates everywhere. Uh, this is especially nice. So if you have an input that, let's say, oh, we want the jump input to be for some weird reason we want it to be on the trigger instead of on a button. Well, you don't have to worry about the fact that the trigger in the old input system is giving you a float value and versus a Boolean event. The enhanced input system lets you filter that well ahead of that point so that your implementation can kind of be agnostic about that, and it's all driven by that blueprint asset. Uh, you don't have to worry about how many places are trying to use that event. You don't have to worry about going through your code and finding all those spots and updating them because it's all done by the blueprint object. It just kind of works. So there's definitely a couple of nice architectural things about enhanced input that makes it kind of neat. Uh, I also feel in a lot of ways this empowers designers. I know I've done setup for some new set of events in the game, set up the blueprint side of it, just the basic objects, not even really messed with the data, set up the mappings, written the code to handle those, and told the designer, hey, here's your toolkit, go have fun figuring out the best way you think of to set up these inputs. So it can be really nice in that fashion. Um, so when you're starting with enhanced input, there are a few things you have to go and do. The first thing is you need to enable it in the plugins. I will note this is marked as, here we go. Oh, this is marked as experimental or beta, I guess, and it definitely kind of feels that way. We're using it on Unreal 4.27, which there's definitely a couple of bugs and a couple of things that are smoothed over in UE5. I have more experience in 4.27 versus 5, so there's to some degree the code I'm doing, since I'm doing this demo in UE5, there may be a couple of differences I'm not fully prepared for, but I think for the most part uh, it transfers. But this is a system that is actively being worked on. Some of the things are changing. It's pretty stable, I feel, and it's pretty robust as it is, but there are changes coming down the pipe. So if you're looking to ship something in a few months, uh, you're probably going to have a bad time. If you're looking to ship something later this year, you might be okay. At least that's kind of the takeaway I have. And as Shortbound has mentioned, they have just added a new remapping system to enhanced input, which should be really exciting. I haven't had a chance to look at that yet, but uh, it's kind of the promise of enhanced input in the way it works has always been, oh, this should be easy to write a remapping system for. Uh, and it's nice that it looks like Epic is making their own, so I don't have to go figure that out down the line for, hey, how do I actually do this? So that should be exciting too. But the first thing you do, you enable the plugin, and then there is another less obvious step in the project settings. In project settings, you go down to input, and here in the default classes, it'll say, hey, this is the default player input class, and this is the default input component. Input class is kind of a high level singleton that does a lot of the grunt work for input processing. Input component is whenever an actor has an input component on it, which is a lot of actors in the game, especially the player controller, player character. Whenever you have a user widget that generates a input component on it, it'll generate whatever the type is here. By default, it's set up to this player input or player input component, and you just need to go swap those over to enhanced player input or enhanced player input component. So that way, when it's instantiating those classes, it instantiates the version that's aware of enhanced input. So with that out of the way, uh, there's one or two architecture points that I want to bring up. If you were here for the that really good just overall input system talk from on Tuesday, uh, there's a couple of different like just there's a couple of ways that Unreal handles input. At the very high level, the life cycle of an input event is the application gets the event either from X input or the window context, and it goes to the Slate application, hey, I just got this event, handle it for me. Slate has some bunch of registered preprocessors that get the first crack at that raw input event, and if nothing there consumes it, it goes, hey, Slate UMG UI layer natively, any of you want this? And if no one there says, oh yeah, I want to consume that, like if you hit D-pad, it'll generate a navigation event, see if anything in the Slate context goes, oh yeah, I want a navigation event to go right in this menu. But if nothing in the current selected context or the current selected hierarchy cares about that, it doesn't get consumed there. And then it goes down to the basic input processing, which lives on uh, the player controllers. In the player controller tick, it'll go and hey, all the input components that have been registered to me, what do you want? This is the level at which enhanced input comes in. So the enhanced input component extends the basic input component. And that means that all the basic input stuff technically works on the enhanced input system. You very rarely, I think, want to do that, but it is there. Uh, that also means that when you're caring about enhanced input, let me bring up Writer real quick. You care about, oh, that was the wrong thing to click. Here we go. You care about the input component. So, for example, this is in the player character for this project. In setup input component, it just passes as an input component, and we cast it to an enhanced input component. And once we know that once we verified it's the enhanced version, then you can bind enhanced input actions to it. I'll walk through this particular code shortly. Um, but you're just basically the same way you used to be binding input events to an input component, you now bind to the enhanced input component using those new signatures. Uh, the other thing that's a little different about the enhanced input system is that it is essentially running all the mapping context and actual event, key event to action processing in a local player subsystem. So a lot of times when you're dealing with it, you'll be grabbing the local player subsystem from the local player and changing mapping context there. Uh, Update winds up routing through there, I believe, and actually, I think that that's pretty much it. Most of the other stuff is done at the input component level, but it's being driven by a subsystem if you don't have any familiarity with subsystems. So that's a thing to remember. So I'm just going to now go and walk through a bit over uh, how I've set up enhanced input in this project. So I have right here, it's time to set up the player input component for this pawn, for my character. I tend at the moment, and I keep oscillating back and forth on this for where the right place to put some of these functions are, but a lot of it is, hey, I want to put movement, I want to put camera stuff, I want to put actions like jump on the pawn and not on the controller, because I might have a different pawn that wants to interact with those differently. Uh, if if I have the same controller possess multiple types of pawns down the line. So in setup player input component, I'm grabbing the enhanced input component and I'm essentially starting to uh, do the bindings. So I have some helper functions here. There's a weird thing in one of the annoyances or kind of pain points with enhanced input. While it is absolutely lovely that, instead of everything being string based, it's asset based, that means you need asset references. So a thing that I have found incredibly helpful for that is I just have a UData asset that's instantiated in Blueprint, and the instance of it I care about is assigned to the controller that just has, okay, here are all of my objects from Blueprint. So for example, there are two basic kinds of object, and I'm going to walk through those in a second. There's input actions. So you have something like, hey, I want to move. I want to look around. I want to jump. I want to interact with something. Those are your input actions. When you wind up binding a function to try and handle those, you are binding to actions. The other thing it has are these input mapping contexts. And an input mapping context uh, is where you actually go, okay, so for these actions, because these are the three actions in this context, for move, look, and jump, but here's the actual keys that are bound to it. Uh, so you wind up having, that level of those abstraction, but the actual key information, and there's going to be a couple other neat things in here to go over, but the actual key information exists on the mapping. The cool thing about the mappings is that you can add and remove them from consideration. So for example, I've got kind of two mappings in this project right now. There's the basic gameplay that has my move, my look, and my jump actions. And I also have an interact mapping. The interact mapping is just whenever I can interact with an object, and I only got 80% of the way through implementing that in this project before it was time for the talk. But what happens is when I'm ready to interact with something, I can just push that interact mapping to the subsystem, add it to the list of contexts, and now it will go through all the mappings I have pushed in priority order, which is assigned by a priority value when you push the mapping. and it'll consume inputs in that order. So you can push mappings on top of each other, and whichever one have the highest priority wind up eating the input, even if there's another handler in a lower priority mapping that would also want that key press. So for example, interact I have set to E on keyboard, but I also have set to bottom face button on controller. In input mapping gameplay, jump also wants that face button bottom. So if both of these were on, if both of these mappings were pushed at the same time, whichever one had the higher priority would be the one uh, whose action actually gets fired. The other one will never get the action because the action from the higher priority mapping will wind up consuming that input instead. So it's nice just because you can think about, okay, I don't have to care about binding and unbinding all of my different sets of actions all at the different time. I can generally leave them bound. But where it I work with instead is I'm constantly changing which mappings are on the stack. If I want to have something where I want to, I've entered a cutscene, I want to disable gameplay, I want to disable interaction, I can just pull both those mappings from the stack. And I don't have to worry about doing other input blocking down the line because those inputs just never wind up getting fired. Uh, that's the very basics of how it works. So just to show you an example of an action, this is what an action is in Blueprint. It's got some options, which pretty well documented, I think. A value type. Uh, this one's digital, so Boolean on and off. It also goes up to, 1D, 2D, and 3D axes. Under the hood, every event that gets fired is a 3D, uh, a vector 3. This just controls how it gets processed later on. There's also, and this is one of the really strong things with this, triggers and modifiers. So a trigger, and I think I actually have an example of something that uses a trigger, jump. So a trigger is basically as these inputs are coming in, do I want to consider this action as having triggered or not? Um, when you invoke the code, uh, there are multiple states, and one of the important ones is trigger. So when you have something triggered, it has passed all of its trigger conditions. This is cool because you can do different things. Pressed is a very simple one. What pressed does, and the description here, is that the trigger will only fire once when the input exceeds the articulation threshold. Holding the input will not cause further triggers. So what trigger does, as an example, is you can set a threshold. This is 0.5. So let's say you were doing this on a shoulder button, a right trigger, let's say. It would not consider this input as having been triggered until that has been pushed down more than halfway. And once it is more than halfway, it will fire the trigger function once. By default, it fires triggered every tick. So the pressed trigger modifies the logic of that so that it works based on that settable articulation threshold and it never refires. The cool thing is you can write your own triggers. They have some pretty good ones here. If you want to make sure, oh, only let me do this, when I have this other action set as well, you can do chorded actions. Hold, and release. You can make it happen on release. You can have it pulse at an interval. And these are all the built-in handlers. And you can write your own. That means that it's really easy for a designer to come in here and if the code is set up right, just go wild with hey, what actually causes this input to fire off? So I really like that about the system. A modifier is kind of something different. Whereas a trigger is, hey, how is this thing firing? A modifier goes, so the values that are pushed into this thing, what are they on the other side? For a Boolean value, that doesn't matter as much. But let's go here to the move action. So it's on the left thumbstick, which you can get either as an individual XY axis. I tend to just use the 2D two axis, the 2D X axis, XY axis, because I like working with that as a vector too. And okay, let me slap a modifier on it. Well, there's just a modifier for dead zone in the project. So I don't have to worry about, you know, oh, how do I configure the dead zone? Do I need to do a filter once I get the input? I can just slap a modifier on it, and the modifier, before it ever considers triggering, just takes the raw value in, or the value from all the previous modifiers in the stack, and it manipulates them. So in this case, it has a lower threshold, an upper threshold. I can set, radial or axial dead zone, and just like that, you have a dead zone. There's a lot of other types of modifiers on here. Dead zones are the one I use the most. I don't usually use too many modifiers, but dead zone's definitely one of the super useful ones. So triggers and modifiers. There is another example. So I forgot to mention this, but triggers and modifiers can be set either per input device in the mapping or per action on the action itself. This is useful. So for example, in the move action, I actually have a modifier because I want to convert the the input I get. So the raw input that the system is dealing with for a modifier, or the raw input this is dealing with for the move action is, so X, and positive X is I want to be right. Negative X I want to be left. Positive Y up, negative Y down. That's just kind of the input space. But that's not what I usually want when I'm thinking in terms of movement. I want positive X to be forwards. So two world space just um, swizzles around a bunch of the different axis values so that, okay, so your plus Y, your up, that's now plus X. And your plus X, on your joystick now turns into a plus Y vector so that it maps to kind of what you would expect world space coordinates to be. So, modifiers are pretty powerful, triggers are pretty neat, but this has all been very abstract. So let's get into how I've actually implemented these things on the character. To answer your question, Wizard Cell, I will go over that shortly on how you set input priority for mapping context. So the way I do it is I just have some helper functions here because I find them much cleaner and nicer to use. And the helper function is just a templated function, does some sanity checks, and it binds typically the trigger function, which is the most important, uh, which is, hey, when this thing's trigger states have been reached, go ahead and process that input. And it binds to the passed in enhanced component the action. So in this case, the action that passed in, let's say, is move. The trigger event is triggered. The object to call the function on and which function to call. If you're used to doing things in C++, this kind of delegate syntax should be pretty common to you. But basically, that means that when the input system decides, hey, we should fire the move action, it will call this function. So there's a couple of different signatures for this function. I typically use the one that uses input action value, and it's as simple as, I do a sanity check. Hey, is this an axis 2D? And then for movement, it's like, okay, I get my control rotation, and I get the value as a vector uh, from the input action value, which remember, because I've in the action and blueprint set up to be world space, I can just rotate that vector by the control rotation vector. And now in the world, when I hit plus Y, once I click in here, well, that's not right. But in any case, when I hit plus Y, I will move forward relative to the camera. So that's just kind of the very basics of how these bindings work. The other half of this, once you have all the bindings set, you also need to make sure you have whatever the appropriate mapping contexts are. So what I will do a lot, this is the wrong file, here we go. In setup and component on the controller, just as a sanity thing, if for some reason this was called multiple times, I go ahead and clear out all the mappings, and then I add in my basic gameplay set. I've written accessor functions for these just because it's nice to have all of this syntax wrapped up in something that's easily accessible if I want to go and add new mappings from like other places in the code. Let's say I'm doing something in a UI component. Uh, it's nice to be able to go, okay, get the controller for this player and just invoke this function on it and not have to worry about uh, all this boilerplate. So the two main functions in the subsystems for adding and removing mapping context are add mapping context and remove mapping context. Add mapping context wants you to say, here's the name of the context. So in this case, the gameplay context is the one that's being set up, and it needs a priority. The priority is an int32. There is a trick that I like to do where I have an enum that's set up, just a uint8, and these are just kind of for things I understand have a very predictable static ordering. I just set up in the order they're supposed to be in so that I can cast that back into a uint8 and it'll put in the right number. I don't have to worry about tracking, oh, have I already put something at level 7? As long as I'm running off of the input priority list, uh, it's fine. That gets a little out of whack when I want something that's not in the input priority list, but uh, actually for that I usually do total at the end, and then I do total plus something, so I can make sure that it's above all the static ones. Uh, but that is just kind of the very basics of how to hook things up. So let me see. This was a lot in like just one go. Does anyone have any questions?
There was one question. Let me pull it
Uh,
up
yeah,
in
Wizard
the
Cell
Discord
was
chat.
asking about
Yeah.
priority.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
that was the part I just got to with whenever you add the mapping context, that's when you pass in the integer for priority. Uh,
Okay. Can you show where you create this thing? Code.
Create which thing?
Okay. Yeah, I see it. Priority. Add mapping context. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. There is something relatively new to me. It's a new as of like January, I think, so I haven't gotten to play with it. But there's also an options object you can pass in that does a couple of things. There is in 427 a really annoying bug in enhanced input where if I press the A button and the thing that's handling that winds up removing the mapping that calls it. So let's say I want to interact with something on the A button or close a dialog with the A button. If I hit the A button, it closes the dialog, it removes the UI, input mapping for that dialog from the list, and it would then, like, the next context that could handle the A would immediately trigger. So even though I've just pushed the button down and done something with it, that next action doesn't know that that button's kind of already been consumed, and so it immediately does whatever the A button would do. Like, let's say it's jump. So you would close the dialog and immediately jump. They've added an option here, and this is something I assume they're still working through and iterating on. But an option to go, hey, if a key is pressed down as a result of this mapping change, don't consider it for other things until it's released. So that's kind of a neat thing that it can do. That they're still going through some of those fixes. It's a shame that it's not in 4.2.7 because that's what we're on. But if you were on, latest UE5, you would have, like, that bug now has a solution.
I actually have another question, but I figured this might be like later in your presentation in regards to saving changed inputs. Like if you rebound a key in your settings or something, and you want to reload it
Yes.
when the game boots up, kind of thing.
So I haven't had to deal with this. I've been punting on this so far. I do know that in my head that was always something possible. Like, I would have to write, okay, so I would need to write my own system for handling, the settings page for it, grabbing the input whenever it's supposed to be rebound, assigning that to some data structure whenever I'm setting up the input mappings, go through them kind of one by one and figure out, okay, so for this object from the settings object that I've saved, swap out this value with this other one, or potentially, copy the object and deal with it. That it was going to be a huge pain. I haven't had to deal with it, so I haven't dealt with it. The good news is that Epic appear to be writing their own solution. Uh, I've not had to. I've not done anything with it yet, so I don't actually know how it works. But let's do it live. There's a bindable player input config. Oop, that was not what I wanted. And I don't know how it works, but I assume it works something like this. Well, I thought it was going to give me more options.
I'm curious what the metadata field is in that case. Oh.
No clue. I'm guessing it's every object in the project. Oh, yes, thank you. Shorebound posted an image of how you do it in Blueprint. All the enhanced input system things can largely be done through Blueprint. I don't have experience doing anything that way, but it's all compatible with a full Blueprint workflow. I know some of my tricks, like, oh yeah, you would need to go implement your own version of my helpers if you didn't want to have to do all the Blueprint boilerplate. But, boilerplate code is even worse in Blueprint than it is in C++, in my opinion. So at this point, if you don't know about Blueprint function libraries, they are a great tool for dealing with that kind of repetitive boilerplate Blueprint work. So I have no idea what this what their system, their bindable input config system is, but it is something that is supposed to be able to handle those kind of, uh, you know, hey, I'm in my settings menu and rebinding my inputs functions. Were there any other questions on this basic, data setup and code invocation stuff?
Yeah, outside of the mappings you were just talking about and other issues you found with the new system. Do you think there's anything you feel like is missing from enhanced input so far?
So, and I didn't have time to get my example of this done. You can use enhanced input with UI. It works. I won't say perfectly fine, but it works. Um, it is a little annoying. So one of the things about the enhanced input system is it will call the mappings are essentially global to a player. Like for that player, it doesn't matter which input components have bound to an object. If a mapping invokes that bound action, any input component that's registered with that player controller can consume it. So you wind up with something where it's like, well, what I really want this to do is I want this particular control, this particular UI to use, I'm trying to think of an example. So let's just say you did something super generic. I want a button config, and I want to press A and have it be, oh yeah, that's the button press. So I have my button press mapping. I have bound on the button's input component to it. So when I get the button press mapping that fires, uh, it consumes that, it generates that action, consumes that action, and the button is pressed. If you have 10 buttons on the screen and they're all currently registered, all their input components are currently registered with the player controller, it will, and if that button input mapping context is pushed, it'll fire one of the buttons, maybe not the one you intended, but it'll fire one of them. So it's a bit annoying to use it in the UI to have to go and work through all of those uh, things. We've essentially settled on, hey, when this goes invisible, or we've settled on something. There's a neat thing we do in our base widget class, base user widget class. Where is it? Do I not have it open? Here we go. We override set visibility, and we go, okay, if our visibility has changed, we have some events that can fire. So a lot of the times, if we have something that it's like, well, when this is on the screen, it wants stick input. So when it becomes visible, we will bind to the input component and push the mapping for it. And when we end our visibility, we will unbind from the input component and remove the mapping for it just to be sure. It's a little clunky. Um, I have not played around with uh, the new common input stuff. It's definitely built a lot more for UI purposes. What I wish the common input system was doing was building on top of enhanced input so that we could get enhanced input, all these cool tools we have with that, but essentially dealing with let's only run it through the hierarchy part. That's not how those things are currently working. Common input has a completely different paradigm with some duplication in that it works almost the same right up until it doesn't kind of way, which is a little concerning. We'll see what happens in the future because both of those features are considered experimental and I have no clue what the future holds for them. So the short answer to your question is I wish enhanced input was better able to bubble or you were better able to control like mappings that are pushed like at the input component level. So I could just make sure that, hey, this is input components at the top of the stack. I can push the mapping just for this input component, and I can make sure that my button works the way I'm expecting. Okay. Uh, Shorebound pointed out, yes, all of the input actions are stateful under the hood. That is how a lot of those trigger conditions work. And I skipped over that in my notes because I wanted to do things in a different order. Let me go back to that. One of the really important things in understanding how enhanced input executes. Let me go back to the character. So I glossed over this. So you have these trigger events, and here I'm showing triggered and completed. There's actually 5 different trigger events. There's started. Started is whenever an input action first starts doing its logic for, hey, am I activated or not? Started is we used to be using it for like, oh, that's on button down, because it fires once the first frame the input is considered. Uh, the problem with using started instead of triggered for that is if you do something like, let's say, oh, I want to, actually, let's just go ahead and show an example. I want jump to have to be held down, and I'm not sure this is the right ordering. I want jump to be held down for half a second. Oh, I guess I can get rid of that. Oh, that was not what I wanted. I want, for some crazy reason, I'm a madman, and I want to try down, hey, jump has to be held down half a second. And I want it to be one shot because I don't want to be firing it every frame once it's fired. So I can press play. And I'm holding A, and it took half a second. That's a really cool tool. I mean, this particular example would be awful, but you can leave it up to design to do that. Like whoever's messing with it, they can mess with it at that level. They don't have, like, the code is, if the code is set up properly, it's totally fine. It just works. Started on that press and hold example will fire the first frame the A button goes down. It does not wait until those conditions or trigger conditions are met. It just goes as soon as it starts evaluating. That can be nice for some input related things. Like, let's say you have a button to do the, oh yeah, to activate this input, hold down square for 3 seconds or whatever that is. You can use started, bind to a started event to go, oh, I want to change my visual state. I want to, change the color of my progress bar at the bottom, or make the progress bar appear, so that we can tell the player, oh yeah, no, this is how long you've been holding relative to the amount of time it takes. So that's what started is. Ongoing fires every frame when the condition is being evaluated but has not yet triggered. So let's say that press to hold example. So I press the A button, it fires the started event, it fires the ongoing event up until it hits that half-second threshold to jump. So when it's in the process of being evaluated but has not yet met its conditions, ongoing is executed. Triggered means this has met all of its execution conditions, and it will by default fire every frame unless you put something in there, like that thing I did. I set the hold to be a one shot, or I use the pressed modifier or the press trigger condition that only allows it to fire once. If you don't have something like that on there, it'll fire every frame so long as its conditions are met. So stick input, you want it to fire every frame. Completed, that is when it has gone from triggered to none. None means like, hey, the base input for this gone. So completed is what fires when you're done, but only when you have had successfully triggered before. And then canceled is when you were ongoing, but you released the input before it ever triggered. So if I tap the jump button, it starts, it does ongoing for a frame or two, and I release the button. without ever having met that half-second threshold, it gives me the canceled event. So if you were doing something like that press to hold, in the UI example, so you bind to started to know to show the progress bar, you bind to completed to fire those effects, triggered to do whatever the UI logic is, ongoing to know you need to update the progress bar percentage, and canceled to know you show the, oh, you let go of the button, reset the state of everything. And just using those events, you can make that input work. And then other, a UI designer can take those things that are already programmatically hooked up and play with those timings as they see fit, play with those things as they see fit in the input mapping or in the input action. Yes, as Old Siren pointed out, super powerful. You can shoot yourself in the foot with it, but I tend to be like, I feel like it's a reasonable set of gates around the functionality that, like, you're not being you're not being incredibly dangerous with it, because you've the big problem is like, oh, I just hooked this up wrong. It's not firing the events that it's supposed to be firing, and I need to go fix that because it's not acting right. I feel like the power is kind of worth it in terms of, not you don't have to get an engineer or programmer, someone to go mess with code to do that kind of, like, oh yeah, you've held down the button for X seconds, and if we want to change that number, well, did we set that up in a property in the data somewhere correctly? You can just go and change it in the one spot. So to me, it feels like a reasonable level of power. All right. Any other questions while I look through my notes?
I think one of the most like best parts about it being all assets is that you can patch these sort of inputs into your game if you have it sort of like hard coded in essentially because like, or not hard coded but like set by the designers and the developers rather than allowing the user to pick them, because then you can patch in like, oh, people were complaining that they need this input for a specific action or something, but it's something that we can't really expose to them in the settings, so we can just add it in via a patch or an update, and it will just naturally handle the mismatch and update it.
Yeah, it is. Something is very wrong with that value. Yeah, no, it's I'm not sure. I'm not sure I quite understand that. Are you saying that because it's just in data and it's asset driven, that you only need an asset update and not a code
Well,
update?
yeah, because like it could be the case because I could see this working really well with the modular. I forget what it's called, but the module system that they added in for UE5, where you can basically uh, put chunks of your game into these modules and then unload them, load them at runtime. Yeah, the game features,
Ah,
uh,
okay.
and then you could include it with that, which is actually what they did with their uh, demos that they posted, or the recent demos in UE5 that they posted. But um, I could see it being really helpful when you add patches and like you're adding new inputs only for this specific area of the game, rather than having to universally affect everything and then you have to manage all those other inputs with it.
Yes. It's totally the thing where, like, if you have, let's say you add a motorcycle into the game, you can just have a totally different mapping and potentially even action, input actions for the motorcycle controls, and have those completely separated out from all your other movement controls. Okay, now it's too slow. Any other questions about enhanced input? Anything you want me to go over again? No? All right. Well, thank you guys very much for coming out. I hope this has given you a better idea of how the enhanced input system works and what it can do, what it's capable of, and where you need to look out for some of the pitfalls. It's still being worked on, so every time you pull, I pull down the latest UE5, it's like, oh, this has changed a little bit, and usually it's a good thing. Sometimes it is like, oh, the function I've been using since I wrote this has been deprecated. Let me go change to the new one. But I I feel like it's definitely it seems to be the way that Unreal is pushing for input to work in the basic input, gameplay input to work for the future, and it feels a lot like it's a much better tool than the old input system. So hopefully you guys get a chance to use it in your own projects and get a chance to play with the power it has.
Are you going to be? I think this would be really helpful to also come back and I guess maybe do a presentation or roundtable in a year or so, because hopefully they'll probably come out of experimental with this plugin, because I could see it being really useful and like some changes and updates, and then something we can all reflect on now that it's actually hopefully released to the public, that kind of thing, in terms of a full release.
Yeah, no, I would love to. Assuming that I'm still working on gameplay stuff in a year, who knows where the winds will take me on that. Uh, it's definitely something I will be dealing with quite a bit in the future. And by next, not GDC, hopefully we've got a lot better understanding of best practices and how to build things for it, and more people who we can do something like a round table rather than this kind of introductory talk.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool. Thank you,
you.
Alex.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you guys for coming out.
Well, take care, everyone.